Thank you everybody for coming out to my talk. I'm going to be talking about App Insights today, so hopefully we'll get a pretty good discussion going on about some of the things we're going to be able to uh, do better as developers and IT professionals to get a better understanding for our apps. I'm from America, so let me first start off by saying thank you for coming out. Also, thank you for our sponsors. And yeah, so if we can just get a clap for them. I need more clapping. So I'm from America, so we're all just really woo. So okay, there we go. All right, better. So much better. So I had planned to try to speak some Danish today, but I really decided I was not going to embarrass myself and also just immediately turn everybody off. So I'll just say my name's Isaac Levin. I work at Microsoft. I'm an application development manager, which is a terrible title. I work in Microsoft Developer Support, which is also a terrible name for an organization. But what I like to call myself is a customer line developer advocate. So my responsibility is I work with customers every day to better the developer experience. So put their developers in a position where they can succeed, and then at the end of the day, help their end users. I blog occasionally up there. I'm also on Twitter and GitHub. This QR code here will take you to basically my resource material. The only downside is that it's a Microsoft marketing thing. Don't worry, your information isn't going to be kept anywhere. But it's good for us to get an idea of the type of attendees that come to our talk. If you really wanted to find these slide decks and these demos, there is a place that's listed up here where you could easily find them. I'm not going to say it, but it's probably pretty obvious. But I would appreciate if anybody has the opportunity to fill that out. It would be very helpful for me. So, first, what I like to start off when I do this talk is I like to just put this word up on the board. Does everybody have a pretty good understanding of what the word telemetry means and how it pertains to our applications? Yeah? So if I picked one of the people that have their hands raised, they give me an answer? Everybody put their hand down immediately. All right, so the definition of telemetry is the collection of events on an object or a metric, right? So what does that mean in application terms? That makes a lot of sense for like hard objects, right? You can collect, on instruments and things like that. But for applications, what does it mean? And we're going to go through all the different types of things that constitute telemetry and how we can leverage them in the application insights world. And we'll talk about App Insights in just a second. But I have some more questions for you because you took your time to learn about App Insights and ask me questions possibly. So I'm going to ask you questions just because I feel it's fair. So who here writes web apps? Whether it be client apps, server apps, both? Who writes desktop apps? Because App Insights now has a port for Windows Desktop. Who has apps deployed to the cloud? On-prem? I found out about 2 hours ago that everybody in Copenhagen loves Azure. So hopefully Azure is your cloud choice. There's other clouds there, obviously. Who here uses current APM tools that are probably more prevalent out on the market, right? One person. Anybody else? AppDynamics, New Relic, Dynatrace, Raygun? Yeah? Okay. So for the people who didn't raise their hands, when you need to get information about your application and logs and things like that, what do you typically do? Do you have nlog? Do you have Serolog, Log4net, some other third-party telemetry collection? Some people are nodding their head. Some people are raising their hand. So the end of the questions I ask is who knows and has used App Insights before? Good amount of you. Who's curious about App Insights? Good. Well, if there were people who did not raise their hands in either of those, the door's up there. So I'm sorry, that was rude, but anyway. So some questions to consider, which are rhetorical. I'm not expecting either before or after this talk for you to have the answer to them, but they're good conversation starters for how we can better our lives, not just as developers or IT professionals or end users, but how application insights can help with that. I like to choose the middle one just because it's in the middle and I like symmetry. So how many times have you been asked to, hey, you have a feature, tell me how many times this feature's gotten used since we rolled it out, right? Probably a lot. And in the past, you'd have to go bother somebody who knew how to write an SSRS report, that poor soul who is still writing SSRS reports to this day, and give a report to your end users. But there's got to be an easier way, and that's where I think App Insights is really valuable. So for the people who raise their hand saying they're interested about it, so App Insights is an APM, or Application Performance Management or Monitor utility that's built inside of Azure. So the data store behind the scenes is JSON, so flattened JavaScript objects, and the mechanism for it is a REST API. So all the stuff we'll be talking about, App Insights and everything, from the end user or client's perspective, it's a REST API. So you send your telemetry up to it, it processes it, does some great machine learning, and then puts it into a data store for you to be able to collect insights on it. And that's it. It's part of Azure Monitor, which used to be called OMS, now it's called Azure Monitor, and it's part of the Insights suite of Azure Monitor. Obviously, it runs in Azure, but it doesn't have to run in it. Like, the actual clients will need to run in Azure as well. So one of the things that we like to pride ourselves with App Insights is that it doesn't matter where your code is hosted or what you wrote the code in, which you wrote your application in, it will work with App Insights. Just the data itself is in Azure. So there are existing SDKs for App Insights for .NET, obviously, since it's Microsoft. If it didn't have good SDK support for .NET, we'd be in trouble. But there's Java support, and these are SDKs that are either owned by Microsoft or owned by the development community, and they're available on GitHub. Java, regular JavaScript, Node.js, PHP, Python, Ruby, and here's my favorite one, anything else, right? So since it is a REST API, and you have some application that can make some application that can make REST APIs, but it's written in a programming language that doesn't have SDK, you could easily, I don't know about easily, it'd be probably a lot of code to write, but you could interface with App Insights and maybe write an SDK yourself and become really popular if you wrote like a Scala SDK or something like that. So I mentioned telemetry earlier. So when we talk about telemetry, what is telemetry as it pertains to applications? So request and response information, right? So, hey, this particular web page was pulled up. There's also things like dependencies. So if you have a SQL call, HTTP client calls, things like that. Page views. So if you have an application that has a front end to it, being able to track the different flows that a user will take from point A to point B and get some of that information. There's some information that's not collected, like PII, personal identifiable information, but things like country of origin, city, state, so those things you can collect demographic information on. Exceptions, which is a big thing. We'll talk about exceptions in a little bit length later, but the last one is my favorite thing that you can collect everything else. So in the situation where you have some domain-specific data, right, and you want to be able to collect telemetry on it, you have the ability, since it's JSON, it doesn't need like an official schema. You can send it up, and it'll submit and write, and you'll be able to query against it or run reports against it. So one example that I like to use is that I worked on a project a few years ago that they're a very, very large brand company. You would know the name, even in Copenhagen. They had an ask to build YouTube for the enterprise. So they wanted to do inside of SharePoint, which makes a ton of sense, right? So they wanted to be able to upload videos to SharePoint, and they wanted to be able to track information about those videos and what users opened them, didn't open them, how long they viewed the video for, what the bit rate was, if they were doing it on their phone or at home or whatever. So we put together a solution with Azure Media Services and App Insights to collect all that information and output it to a Power BI report, right? So App Insights doesn't know anything about video bit rate or whether or not the video was opened in full screen or not. But since you can just send everything else, you can easily do that with App Insights. So it's one way to just extend the experience. It's not just the top 5 things you see here, right? It's literally anything that you see value of logging and being able to report on it, you can leverage with App Insights. I like to show this diagram, even though I disagree with the white background in this particular sense, but on the left-hand side, you have everything that will send telemetry, right? So you have client apps, whether it be just a static HTML site, right? There's obviously web services and servers, and then all of your dependencies. That goes into this big black box that has application insights. And within that black box, it does a lot of things and aggregates the data in a particular way that allows you to extend it using these things. We're going to talk about the things in green on the right-hand side in a little bit more detail later, but these are just some of the things. There are endless opportunities for you to leverage the data and App Insights to your heart's content. So, how do I instrument? We talked about all the things that you can get with App Insights and the ability to collect all this great stuff, and we're talking all these amazing things. So it's got to be probably pretty substantial to invest in it and load it onto your app, right? Right? No? Is it? Who thinks it's really hard? Oh man, who thinks it's really easy? Who doesn't care and wants to take a nap after lunch? Oh, guy in the back raised his hand. He's honest. Everybody else is not honest. So, as one would imagine, it's probably pretty easy. So, I like to see there's three major ways to get App Insights lit up on your app. One is I have the code, and I can make changes to it and deploy it. Two, I don't own the code, and I don't want to deploy it, and the code's an app service, and the code's on-prem or on some IIS box. It could be an IIS box on AWS, GCP, your local infrastructure, what have you. So before I start and show you what the things, the different ways that you can light up App Insights, I want to show this very important side. This is pricing, right? The first question that people ask me about App Insights is, well, sounds great. How much does it cost? You, sir, can you tell me what this word here says? Free? Louder. Everybody heard him? He said free? You can also read it too. But so App Insights comes with 5 gigabytes of flattened JSON data for free. That's in and out. So what that means is you can put data into App Insights and pull it out to the amount of 5 gigabytes of flattened per resource. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it can when you're in production workloads, right? So the recommendation is obviously for different environments, you'd probably want different App Insights resources. And then if you need to go over 1 gig, it's $2.30 per gigabyte, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a ton. Another thing to call out too is that there's 3 months of data retention. So if you log something and then 3 months later, that data's gone completely, unless you get it out of App Insights. And we'll talk about some ways that you can get it out of App Insights later. So you can enable the extension on App Service directly. So this involves no code at all. So what you do is you go into the app. Most people have seen the Azure portal before? Yeah? Who here hasn't seen the Azure portal? That is awesome. That's the first time ever, and I've done this talk a lot of times. So when you go to your app service in the Azure portal, if you don't have App Insights lit up, it'll give you this nice purple message saying, click here to access. Or you can click down there and look at the larger App Insights box. Once you click that, it's going to walk you through setting up the site extension. So to light up Application Insights, it needs to be able to do a few things. It needs to be able to put some DLLs in the bin directory of the application, and then add some configuration files to your applications directory as well. And it will do all that for you. You just have to enable the site extension to do that. So once you click turn on site extension, it will walk you through some of the options that you have when you turn on App Insights, right? So you can specify what kind of application you have, whether it's .NET, .NET Core, Java, or Node.js. You have the ability to change the resource, so you can set the name for it, the location, if you want the resource group. And then you have some other settings that are further down that I didn't capture in the screenshot, but different features that you can light up with App Insights. And then you click Apply, and you're done. That's option 1. So if you have the code and you have access to Visual Studio and you can do a deploy, you can actually configure App Insights directly inside of Visual Studio itself just by using some of the built-in integrations between Visual Studio and App Insights. So how you would do that, you right-click on your project, you go to Add, you go App Insights Telemetry. It'll walk you through yet another wizard, and then that wizard will say, do you want to register an instance of App Insights? One good thing to call out here, and I don't know if the people in the back can read at the very, very bottom, but it says, just add the SDK to your local-only application. So that means that you can turn on for local debugging and look at what App Insights is collecting and do some searching inside of Visual Studio without ever committing to being in Azure. So this is a great opportunity that if you're not 100% sure, if you want to use App Insights, you can play around with it without having to create anything in Azure. Great in the scenario where if you work for a company where your IT locks down the ability to create resources. So once you go through that, it'll give you this nice little window saying these are the names of the resource groups that you've created, or the resources, and some of the different configurations options that you have. So that's if you have app service or if you have the code. What if you don't have the code and you're not an app service, right? So what happens if you're just an IIS? If you're on-prem or you're in some other cloud and your application is hosted on a VM using IIS. There's a status monitor tool for that. So you can install the status monitor tool on your IIS box, and it'll actually walk you through lighting up App Insights at the website level. So options for everybody. Does anybody want to see me doing some of these steps? Sure? Cool. Because you don't have a choice. That was the biggest laugh I got. Cool. All right. So I have a very important business application that runs my entire Fortune 500 company on it. It is built on ASP.NET 4.6.1 web forms. This is very important. All of my important intellectual properties built into this application. I can do things like look at the About Me section. I can look at the Content section. This is a very important application, right? I deployed it yesterday. So it's an app service. It's deployed out to app service. And like I said, it's not .NET Core. It's just .NET Framework. So I want to be able to turn on App Insights, and I don't want to do a code deployment. So how I would do that is I can click Application Insights here, and it's going to go through the widget that we talked about, turn on the site extension, set a location. I'm going to set North Europe because I'm in North Europe at the moment. You can give it a name. You can choose, and these are some of the options that we talked about that I scrolled over or didn't have in a screenshot, but different features that you can light up. And we'll talk about Profile and Snapshot Debugger later, but it just gives you the ability to add particular things. So you click Apply, you click Yes, and then what it's going to do is it's going to turn off your app service, so that's a big thing. Turns off your app service, so it's not available once this is happening. It installs the site extension and turns it back on. And then once that's done, you have App Insights turned on. This process can take a little bit of time, so while that's doing that, I want to show you this application and turning it on in Visual Studio. Can anybody see this in the back? Yeah, it's not too small? All right, so as you can see here, in my references, there's no reference to App Insights in any DLLs. I don't have anything fancy, like I'm not hiding anything from you. So if I right-click on my project, click Add, and this is always fun because Visual Studio sometimes freezes when I do this, Application Insights Telemetry, and then I can walk through the getting started here. So we talked about earlier creating a resource. I can select an existing resource or not. Let's just create a new resource. I can configure the settings here. I can specify where I want it to live, and then I can click Register. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to include some references to the Application Insights NuGet package that exists. It's going to add some configuration files, and most importantly, it's going to include an instrumentation key. So the instrumentation key is how you differentiate different versions of App Insights resources in your environment. So it's a GUID, or GUID, depending on how you like to pronounce that. So this does take a little bit of time too sometimes, but at the end of the day, when we're all done, let's just see if this works. All right. So we go back to App Service, and you click App Insights. You click View Application Insights Data. You're turned on, right? So there's no data here right now because I just turned it on. But over the course of time, my Fortune 500 business application is going to be reporting all sorts of telemetry to it without me adding any code at all. So all the things we talked about earlier, exceptions, SQL dependencies, page views, all that stuff, collected by default with no code needed, right? That's pretty cool. So same experience whether you do it through application service or if you're doing inside Visual Studio, same out-of-the-box experience. Okay. So I have my data lit up, or I have my application lit up with Application Insights telemetry data now. What do I do with it, right? So the answer really is you can do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, there are a few things to do that are probably really important right out of the box. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create a dashboard. This dashboard takes one button click, right? You have an App Insights resource. In the App Insights resource, you can say dashboard, you click that, and then it creates you an Azure dashboard that looks just like this. So imagine having to write that by hand. No, nobody wants to actually imagine doing that. So that's the number one thing that I highly recommend doing once you get App Insights lit up. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're probably going to want to go into Application Map. So Application Map gives you a holistic top-down view of all of the things that Application Insights is collecting data from. So it can be everything from your servers, your front-end applications, dependency calls, like if you have SQL, storage, external third-party DLL or third-party APIs, so forth. And it gives you the ability to drill down into them and get really intricate transaction detail. So this is Profiler. So Profiler actually allows you to trace at a particular point in time. You click a button, it says trace, and it'll actually show you the timing of all the different calls in your code one by one, right? So if you have a call that's taking 2 seconds, you can find out at the function iteration level what thing is taking all that time, right? So extremely valuable. You also have the ability, using Metric Explorer, to create visualizations that look like this with not very many lines of code. Who here has used KQL? Yeah. So KQL is it's the log analytics querying language. It uses pipes instead of SQL commands, but it looks very much like SQL. You have the ability to create visualizations using KQL, which I'll show you, or you can actually just do it through a designer. So you can click, give me a sum of user requests in a particular area and click submit, and it'll do something like this, right? So average CPU percentage by instance, that's just a couple of clicks in a wizard to get that, which is extremely valuable. Live metric stream. So one thing to call out about App Insights is that from the point of your application sending data to the cloud and you being able to consume that data takes a little bit of time. It can take anywhere from 90 seconds to about 2 minutes, right? So it's not real time, but it's very, very close to real time. If you do need real time to look and see what's going on, you have Live Metric Stream. So Live Metric Stream is real time over the wire tracking of your application, sending telemetry up to the cloud. So in the situation where you're under load and you need to know what's going on and you can't wait 2 minutes for App Insights to get that data for you to query, you can track it using this view right here. And all these things I'm showing you are available inside of the Azure portal. Power BI. So obviously, in the world of reporting, Power BI is very, very important. You have the ability to export major information out of App Insights with just a few clicks, right? So this is the demographic information for an application, right? So it gives you great info like where your requests are coming from, what the operating system is, and obviously how many users happen per day, right? So very, very valuable information to our stakeholders to be able to report on these sort of things. And without this, you kind of have to rely on somebody else probably to build out a report like that for you. So one great thing as well about App Insights is that it's integrated with Visual Studio. So this is the Visual Studio search of App Insights. So you can do this when your code is in the cloud or if you're just debugging locally. You can go through and take a look at all the different requests that are happening, filter them, and see what the data is coming out through there inside Visual Studio instead of going out to the Azure portal. And then finally, I mentioned earlier that in the situation where if you need to hold on to the data for more than 3 months, you can use continuous export. Continuous export, what it does is it takes your App Insights telemetry and dumps them into an Azure Blob Storage container. So you can have that data forever, and then once it's in the Blob Storage container, you do whatever you want with it, right? You can export it to some file share somewhere. You can report against it. You can even export it to a SQL database for relational querying if you'd like to. So I want to show you a couple of cool things that we can do consuming the data in App Insights. So I have another really awesome application that I wrote. It's called Tour of Heroes. Has everybody heard of Tour of Heroes? Yeah? Anybody here developed Angular before? Like new Angular, not JS? Just one guy? Okay. So Angular, or the Tour of Heroes is basically an Angular 7 application, and I modified it to use an ASP.NET Core 2.2 backend. So in here, I have a list of some of the people that I respect. Some of them are athletes. Some of them are well-known people. And I can click on them. I can view their information. I can search for them, except I'm having an issue whenever I search. We'll take a look at that in a second. But I can drill down into all these things and modify them in my heart's content, right? So this is that particular application with App Insights turned on, right? So I went through the same process that we did earlier, and I have some really valuable information here. So I can look at my failed requests. It looks like I have 20 failed requests. My response time is around 28 milliseconds. If I drill into application map, I see here that I have one instance. It's hitting just a SQL database, and I have an availability test running on. So availability test in App Insights allows you to set up a ping to particular URLs just to basically make sure your application is working as expected. And right now my availability test is around 67%, which isn't that great. So we'll need to probably figure out what's going on there. So if I click into this particular instance, it gives me some really invaluable information, right? So it gives me my slowest request by name, it gives me some common properties, and then it gives me failures. So if I click Investigate Performance, I can take a look and see all of the operations that take a long time, right? So Get Hero takes a little bit of time. Post Agent Post, I have a feeling that it has probably a bot that's doing that. I can look at dependencies as well. So it looks like I have a dependency of a SQL query, or a SQL database. Obviously, I can take a look at some of the request counts that go out across the wire. And then I can look at user roles, right? So these are not the user roles, the server roles. So if I have multiple instances of my application running, I can actually filter down at the server level and see, oh, this particular server is having issues. I need to, turn it down or redirect traffic somewhere else, right? So being able to do things like that is very, very valuable. Also, I can do live metric stream. So let me just move this to a new window. By the way, if anybody is noticing, I'm using the beta version of Edge that was released yesterday. So I highly recommend, if you haven't played around with it yet, this is the opportunity to do so. It's available free of charge for download. It's Edge built on top of Chromium. So I'm loving the experience so far. So if I go and I have live metric stream turned on, so it looks like I get an exception here. So if I search, an exception is going to come across on the right-hand side in a second, right? So I have some exceptions, right? So this is real time. I have the ability to drill into some of these and get some more valuable information. And this is in real time, right? In the situation where I have some failures and I want to take a look at them, I can click on the failures link, maybe maximize this, and it'll give me the top 3 exception types that are happening with my application, right? So I can see here that if I drill in, I'm getting the only exception that I get is argument out of range exception. So if I click on that, it'll give me a list of sample operations to read into. I can sort them by relevance or date. And if I click into one, it's going to give me an end-to-end transaction detail of that user's path to these exceptions. So there's all sorts of things here that are interesting to look at, right? So I can take a look at this request at this level, and it's going to give me some valuable information here. And I can see the exception. So it looks like an unhandled exception occurred. And the fail method is the controller, and there's some other stuff. This is the actual call stack that exists, right? So imagine in the past when you needed to get that, right? Sometimes it wasn't easy. But that's not really helpful because sometimes call stacks aren't really good. If I check the just my code box, it gives me, zoom in, gives me a line number, right? How many hours have we spent as developers trying to just get that? Just the line number of a code that's throwing an exception, right? And this is all collected by default. So App Insights gives you that ability. And one of the also really cool things about when you're flying around App Insights is that everything has this little button next to it. So this button links you over to be able to write log analytics queries using KQL. So when I hop over here, it'll take this particular thing, and this takes unions all of my different App Insights nodes, and it gives me some valuable information. But in the situation where I want to write something myself, so let's take a look at, so I'm not from Copenhagen, right? So I'm from right outside of New York City, and I'd like to get an idea of who across the world is using that really, really awesome Tour of Heroes app. So I can do that just by writing a KQL query against the request node. So I'm just going to do a summarize, and let's just do a count, and let's do client, country, or region, and I want to summarize by the same thing, right? So if I do that, and it comes back, it's going to show me a count of all the particular hits in a 24-hour span that my application has gotten in a particular area, right? Obviously, Most of it is in the U.S., but I have some from Australia, some from the U.K., Singapore, what have you. And here's the most important thing. The chief marketing officer says, I would really like to know in a pie chart form this data. And you're like, okay, well, let me go make a request to the data team, and they'll put together an SSRS report. Or you can just click there. You can click chart, and then you have a pie chart, right? That's pretty cool. So the next thing is like, that's great, but I don't want to go to this website. Oh, that's fine. I'll just export it to Power BI for you. Or if I want access to this data, I can just export the flat data as CSV, right? Just the power to be able to do things like this is extremely, extremely valuable, right? Okay. So let's go back here. I have a production issue. How many times have you heard that? Raise your hand if you heard that. Yeah? And the person always comes to you in a great mood, right? And you're in a great mood after that conversation's been had. As developers, we hear this all the time. Somebody will knock on our cube or office or whatever and say, hey, there's an issue in production with this application. We got to figure out what it is right away. CIO is freaking out. CMO is freaking out. And what's the first thing we usually do? What's causing this problem? So what's causing this problem? The answer is it depends, right? So it could be environment configuration, and it could be data exposing particular bugs in our code because we never get the opportunity to code against production data for obvious reasons. It could be scaling issues, like maybe your application just isn't ready for that. What else, right? These are the main three things that I think of, but if anybody has any interesting examples, I'd love to hear them. Everybody's so polite. Nobody's asking questions or talking at all. Did anybody have good lunch? Clap if you had good lunch. All right. Just got to make sure you're alive up there. I know this stuff is super riveting because everybody wants to learn about logging, right? But logging is so hot right now. You should definitely be into logging. I digress. So when we have issues in production and we figure out what the issue is, how do we get to a path of resolving it? We triage it, right? So what are the different ways that we can triage particular scenarios, right? We can copy down production data to our local environment. That's sometimes an option. Other times it's not an option at all. Like maybe the data is just too big. Maybe the data's got personal identifiable information in it. Maybe you don't have a machine that can handle that sort of thing, so on and so forth, whatever, right? Maybe you can use a production staging environment if you're gifted with one. Like maybe you have an environment that's like pre-prod that you can actually play in. I haven't had very many opportunities to do that, so I definitely would appreciate being able to do so. But I know some people get that option. You can read logs if you hate yourself. There are IS logs and database logs and so forth, right? That's the best option, right? But there's also one more option. No? No? There's silence. Who here's done this? All right. One person is honest and the rest of you are just liars. Yeah, right. So obviously this is not a good idea. For why? What's the biggest reason why you don't want to do this? Anybody, please, just give me something. Is it because the application can't be used once you're attached to it? Right? And you definitely don't want your end users to not be able to use an application, right? So I'm going to say no to that. Everybody know who this is? This is a stupid American thing? Yeah? Okay, cool. It's Randy Jackson. It's a show called American Idol. And his catchphrase is, nah, it's going to be a no for me, dog. So basically, we're not going to do that because, one, terrible experience for you as a developer because there's 30 people at your desk watching you do this because that's how things work. Two, anybody who wants to use your application can't because you're doing that. And three, your business is completely defined by that outage, right? I have a customer right now that they did something similar to this because they had no other options. And let's just say that things blew up on Twitter very, very strongly. And it just wasn't a great experience. And you had to put out PR releases. And you can't say, oh, we had a developer attached to production because first off, nobody would care and nobody would understand. And people are like, why the fuck are you doing that, right? to be a better option. And does anybody think there is a better option? Yeah, maybe. I wouldn't be talking about it if there wasn't a better option. Like, this is the end of my talk, guys. There's no better options. Have a good day. No? All right. Snapshot debugger. Has anybody heard of Snapshot debugger? Cool. And everybody else, do you want to know what it does? Cool. All right. So Snapshot debugger gives you the ability to get full stack trace, full locals inside of Visual Studio, and a debuggable instance of Visual Studio pointed at your it doesn't even have to be production, your applications somewhere, right? So think about that. In the past, we connected to remote, right, in Visual Studio. Snapshot debugger allows you to do that, but it doesn't take down the application in the process. Sit on that for a second. You mean to tell me, Isaac, that I can debug against our cloud applications or even take a look at some of the information that's going on with our on-prem applications without it taking down the site? Sure I can. And I wouldn't lie to you and say yes if I couldn't show it to you. So this is what it looks like, right? So when you go through App Insights and you're clicking through and you look at the failures, some exceptions will track a snapshot if you have it turned on. So adding Snapshot debugger is a little bit of code. It does require a Visual Studio Enterprise license. So if you don't have Visual Studio Enterprise, this is probably the #1 reason why I would go to my boss tomorrow and say, I need this like now. And the beauty of it is that there's two ways to use it, right? There's a passive approach, which you'll be collecting snapshots over the course of time, and then there's another option as well, which is a bit more reactive, which I can show you. But again, right? So this is your locals window. So you see there's an exception here, and you see a call stack, and you're going to have all that in Visual Studio. And I can show it to you, but everybody's like sleeping, so I'm just going to not show it, and we'll just go on to the next talk. Cool? No? No? Everybody's like, oh man, this guy, he's the worst. Is it just a politeness thing? Maybe? Or maybe nobody cares? No, whatever. What was that? It's 4 o'clock? Does that mean that everybody's supposed to be napping at 4? All right. Going home, you have a whole talk tomorrow. You have a whole conference tomorrow. So the application that I showed up here earlier, let me just close that. Let me just open this. Right, so our Tour Heroes application, I'll just close some other stuff. So this has Snapshot debugger wired up to it, as one would imagine, because I'm showing it to you right now. So I mentioned earlier that every time I try to do a search, I get an exception. And we took a look earlier and we found out that the exception is an argument out of range exception. And it gave me a line number. But that's not good enough for me. I want to be able to take a look inside of Visual Studio what's going on, right? So, did I close my Azure portal link? Oh no. All right, no. All right. Now things would be really embarrassing because I have to hop around to like 6 different things. Okay. I'm not going to be able to see that there. Let's just take a look. App service. No. All right. Sign in with a different account. I got bit really hard by the demo guys here because I closed a browser tab. Never close browser tabs. Alrighty. Cool. All right. So take a look here. Open this guy up, and we'll look at some of our failures. We give our list our failures. We see there's some argument out of range exceptions. I can click on those. I can only check the ones that have snapshots attached to them. Now, just by date, just to be safe, I'll click that one. And then I have a list, right? So if I click on these, some of them have an option that says Open Snapshot, right? So it's going to look very much like that screenshot that I showed you earlier. It's going to analyze your snapshot. It's going to give you some information. It's going to show you a call stack. But the most important thing is it's going to give you the ability to download a file. So what it's going to do is it gives you the option to download a die accession file. So if you haven't heard of a die accession file, it's basically a file that has links to modules and symbols to be able to get a Visual Studio experience. So and sometimes these files can be big. They range from like 70 megs to thousands if possible. So I'm going to download one really quick. So if you guys can just wait No, I have one. Oh my God, my jokes are failing miserably right now. Um, so I downloaded a file this morning from an exception that I had this morning, and when you open up the file in Visual Studio 2019 or in 2017, which is supported in, it'll give you this very strange message, right? So it'll say the following file comes from an untrusted source. The file came from Azure. I don't know why that says that. Go about your day. Click yes, right? So when you click yes, it's going to load in that diet session file, and it's going to give you a mini dump summary. So right inside that mini dump summary, it's going to give you some cool things like the modules that are attached to this application. It's going to give you some timing. So it happened 11:50 p.m. I'm going to guess that's either local time or maybe I was doing it last night. I don't remember. OS version and stuff like that, right? The most important thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to click Debug with Managed Only. So Debug with Managed Only is going to load all the symbols that exist into your local context, and it's going to actually spin up a debugging session. So argument out of range exception right here, right? But this is in throwhelper.cs, which isn't really valuable to me because it's an internal thing. So if I go into my call stack and I click at the actual code that threw the exception, we talked about line 36 earlier. So if I click on this, it's going to basically say you have a source file that's different than that exists out in the cloud. That's because I made some changes to this, but I can click yes still, and it will load this. This is my code that threw an exception. Why would it throw an exception here? To demo it, yeah! No, but seriously, because I'm trying to show something very stupid, right? So I'm getting something from a database. I don't know how many options are in that, or items are in that database, especially from that list. And then I'm going to get the fourth item in it, which what could go wrong, right? So right now, I'm having a debugging session. But this isn't really valuable until I can hover over the name, right? So, all right. So name is Bill, so that shows you what happened. I have immediate window, so I can go name, right? I have Bill. I can do watch. I can do different exceptions things. I can do all those things, right? And this is for an exception that happened in the past in production, and we have to be able to debug in Visual Studio and see all the different variables at scope and what their values were, right? Is that pretty cool? Would that be valuable to anybody? Yeah? Yeah, I hope so. That was the most enthusiastic response I've gotten the entire talk. So I guess making your lives better is a good thing. Question. Yeah! They're clapping because you're going to ask a great question. Yes, it does. I don't work for the product group, but I know that's the number one thing that I report back to them when I do this talk. I've heard that people are very vocal about it. I don't know if it's actually happening. People are like writing immediately, like, "Oh, it's coming out next month." No, I don't know, but I would expect there to be something in the future. Maybe not the full snapshot debugger experience, but maybe something that gives you more, right? So one of the things is Snapshot Debugger. Let's just talk a little bit about what it does, right? So Snapshot Debugger, at the time of exception, it actually has an agent that's running side by side with your application. The performance degradation, there is some, but it's less than 2%. That's tracking for millions and millions of requests. So there is a performance degradation, but it's less than 2% every single time. What it does, it'll spin up a separate clone of that particular process. It's going to do a mini dump process on it. It's going to get all the symbols and everything out of it, and that's going to spin up that file. So that's what's happening behind the scenes, right? There is another version of Snapshot Debugger, which is a bit more complex, and I want to show it to you right now because it actually allows you in real time to do this. Like I had to download a file here and open it and do some stuff, but it'd be really valuable if I could do it in real time. Similar to what we used to do in the past when we used to attach to remote, but it doesn't take down a production application. So would people like to see that? Man, I'm just like pulling it out of you. So this particular feature, it's to app service. So if you have app service, or which was recently announced last week, if you have containers, so if you're a Docker container in Kubernetes, you can have this feature. In virtual machines in Azure, you have this feature, and as well as time travel debugger, which I highly recommend you doing. And you also get similar experience. But one thing I wanted to call out before I showed you the real time is that this particular diaccession file that I downloaded, it wasn't from my application that's running in the cloud. I have the same application deployed locally on my machine and on a Windows Server IS box that doesn't have anything to do with Azure at all. And I collected this. So you don't need to be in Azure to use this, getting the file, right? That's really important for me to call out. You do not need to be in Azure to use this. You'll need to be in Azure to do the next thing I'm going to show you, but not this. You can be in AWS or on-prem for this. All right, so what's next? So I talked about there being a passive approach and a more reactive approach, right? So the reactive approach is I want to attach to an instance of this application. And I can do that inside of Visual Studio. So if I go View here and I go Cloud Explorer, and I take a look on the right-hand side, all of my app services, I can right-click on one of them and go Attach Snapshot Debugger. And what this is going to do is it's going to ask, where do you want these symbols to be stored temporarily? So you say, okay, that's my Azure resource, and that's where I want it to go. I'm going to click Attach. So what this does in the background is it basically ensures that you have the extension turned on. It checks a couple of things, makes sure that you have the correct write access against your, interesting. Usually there's a thing that pops up, like a little dialogue, but didn't this time. But when it's done, you'll get a message like this, right? So this means that you're ready to go with App Insights, or not, Snapshot Debugger. And then while this is happening in the background, it's actually loading all the symbols for you. And once the symbols are loaded, this little start collection will turn on. So I'm going to pin this over here. I'm going to pin this over here. I'm going to go here. And I'm going to stall because that green button, sometimes it takes way too long. Sometimes it comes up like immediately. So I'm going to give an opportunity to ask questions. Anybody want to ask some questions about this? Please help me. Yes?
Can you attach to any, like if you want to see timings for a well-functioning endpoint?
Yeah, so the question was, can you attach to anything, right? So I'll show you what the experience is to attach. It's very similar to debugging. So in the past, like when you debug in local environments, you use like a breakpoint. So this particular mechanism, they're called snap points, and this green button turned on, and I'll show you what that looks like. So if I click any here, right, so I have this line of code, right? I want to take a look. This is my get hero route, so every time I pull up the details page for a hero, it gets it from the database, and then I check if it's null or whatever, right? Don't judge me for writing bad code. If I click on line 53 right here, a little purple hexagon is going to come up. So that little hexagon is called a snap point. And if I click Start Collection, what that does is it sends the snap point to the cloud, and then all I have to do is just click on, like Bill Gates, for instance, and then once that's loaded on this in the diagnostic tools, it's actually going to load a snapshot for me. Right? So if anybody wants to test that website right now, you can, and it'll generate snapshots. So if I click on any of those snapshots that come up here, click View Snapshot, it's going to do the exact same thing as the passive mode, right? So it's going to actually collect all the symbols, and it's going to load all your PDBs and all these sort of things. So it does take a little bit of time sometimes because it does download a file. But once that's done, you're going to get the same experience that you have with passive mode, right? So line 53 is going to fire like a breakpoint. You're going to have the locals. You're going to have call stack. You're going to have the immediate window and all those other things that are really valuable. And there's one additional extension on top of snap points called log points, which allows you to actually write out local information to this diagnostic tools window. So in the situation where you have an application that maybe a function that has like 10 parameters in it, and you know one parameter is usually the cause of the problem, instead of having to kind of weed through that, you can actually put a log statement in there and says, what's the value of this parameter of this particular exception? And then it'll get you on your way quicker to being able to solve your problems. Yes? At this point in time, no. So there was an announcement with Visual Studio 2019 last week, or whenever that was, the 2nd, I think, where they showed time travel debugging. So time travel debugging is a very similar experience to this, except it's only for Azure VMs right now, infrastructure as a service. So you have the ability to step forward and backward in time for a snapshot, but it's only available right now, and I believe it's because of resource constraints, right? Because with an Azure VM, you have substantially more power than you would an app service, right? Typically. Does that answer your question? Cool. This is taking a long time as I expected. So instead, what I will do is I will just keep moving on, and I will go actions, and then I will set an action here. So I'm going to just have my hero is, and this uses string interpolation, so I can just type in that hero name, right? I'm going to check to make sure that it goes to my application log and the output window, and click close, and I'm going to do an update. My snapshot's collected and updated, so I'm going to click Nelson Mandela, and what will happen is that a log point gets created, right? That's kind of cool, right? Yeah? That cool? Clapping. I heard clapping. So this has taken a long time, so I'm just going to move on. Move on to the end. So, so that snapshot debugger, again, there's two approaches, right? So first approach is passive. Just requires your application to be instrumented with Snapshot Debugger. You can Google Snapshot Debugger or Bing it or whatever, and it'll go through and it'll list out how to do that. It's like writing some code and adding it to your startup class if you're in ASP.NET Core, or adding some stuff to Global ASAX and filters in .NET. The only drawback and caveat is that your application needs to be .NET Standard 2.0 compliant. So it's a .NET only feature. So I believe that's 4.6.2 in .NET Framework and .NET Core 2.0 in Core. So, definitely a possibility for most developers out there. So that's the first approach, right? So the passive approach is getting the file and doing all those things, right? So your code can be hosted anywhere. You just need Snapshot Debugger turned on in your app. The second option, which I showed you, is the attach. That's for app service. And the gentleman over here talked about being able to step forward and backward. That's time travel debugging, and that's only available in Azure VM. All right, so here's my references. So there are some links to some really, really cool stuff up out there while everybody's getting their phone.